Joining us to discuss this is Max Wolff. He's a partner at Manhattan Venture Partners. Max, always good to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So, Max, China's National Information Center is projecting that the sharing economy is going to make up 10% of China's GDP over the next 4 years. What's your forecast?
Yeah, so I think that's probably a conservative estimate. I think we might see even more. Of course, all these things hinge on exactly the details of definition. And when it comes to the sharing economy, one of the few things we all agree on is what it is. So it can be a bit tricky.
That we all agree or don't agree on?
We do not agree, right? So there's a lot of different definitions, almost one definition for every person who has an opinion. So it's tricky to nail down. That seems like a conservative estimate. My guess is we could easily see that number north of 15%.
So what's this person's opinion? How do you define the sharing economy in China?
Yeah, so I think the name, unfortunately, sharing is a bit of a misnomer. What it usually is on-demand, collaborative alternatives to ownership. That's usually how we've tended to look at it at Manhattan Venture Partners and in our research. Try to be broad here because there isn't much sharing about it. It's really being billed for things that you don't own because you can't afford them, or renting out things you do own because you can't afford to have them unless you make some money off them too, a lot of the time. And that's obviously a mouthful, but it's not exactly sharing in the sense we learned as kids.
It's not the sharing is caring. I give you mine, you give me your sense. Absolutely agree with that. But for purposes of this discussion, we'll refer to it as a sharing economy. And China has launched the official commission on the sharing economy. That includes the taxi app, Didi, Tencent, Lenovo. Now, many other countries have not yet established an umbrella body like this. So what is the significance that China has? And what impact is that going to have?
So it's a good idea, and I think we're going to see a lot of people following suit. I know that various private entities have tried to figure out a definition. Price Waterhouse in the U.S. has worked on that. We've seen some conferences. We've seen news outlets try to take the kind of mantle here and define it. It's going to be important because it's radically changing how property is bought and how people work and what workers' rights are. So we need to do it. And the U.S. Department of Labor is belatedly coming to a realization that they need to do something like what China did soon for statistics and labor regulation.
Certainly, regulation is a big sticking point when it comes to the whole sharing economy. China recently officially legalizing ride sharing, announcing national regulations and guidelines for ride sharing or transport apps or services that you want to call that are replacing the traditional taxi. Now, the rules are more accommodating than a draft version that was out there. What do you make of this move to formalize the situation?
So I think we're seeing the Chinese government get out in front of what is happening all over the world. And that is, by the time governments got around to trying to regulate this, this was a livelihood for millions of people, and it was a multi-tens of billions of dollars industry. So shutting it off or sweeping it under the rug stopped being an option. Ground zero has often been the hotel industry, upset about room sharing, and taxi, limousine, and bus companies upset about ride sharing. But long before they were able to mount a real defense, so many people started earning a living and working in this space that they really couldn't stop it, so you might as well get out in front of it. We're going to have to late in the game. New York has been somewhat aggressive with this, but the Chinese government has led the national front level, and others will have to follow.
So it's interesting that they have stood in front of the trend, like you're saying, and most other countries are still not out there with formal regulations.
Yeah, I mean, lots of folks pretend it's not happening or try to enforce old regulations that don't work because the new technologies are as successful, viral, and rapid as they are because they're really good at skirting old rules and old enforcement mechanisms.
Well, adapt or die, and we've got to adapt because this is the reality. Now, what does it mean for the people traditionally employed in the more traditional version of these sectors, like you mentioned in the hotel industry, or taxi drivers that were in the traditional taxi sector? What does it mean for their employment? Are they moving over to the new sharing economy way, or is this hampering their earnings?
So for a lot of folks, particularly younger folks, it's a good opportunity to throw off some of the absolute control that the bosses used to have and be a little bit more of an independent contractor in the bad ways of having to worry about some of their own livelihood issues that used to be done by an employer, benefits, et cetera, but in a nice way, not being under the heel of the employer quite as much. That tends to be the most true for young people and people who are comfortable for technology. Older workers and people who are uncomfortable with the technology have tended to fare very poorly, as have some of the more rigid legacy companies. So local taxi companies all over the world, China, US, and elsewhere, are really struggling. And some of the marginal bed and breakfast and hotel room operators are really struggling. Some of the small-time handymen really struggling in the face of various handyman services. So it really is a tale of two different groups. Being good at technology and being nimble as a huge reward. Being rigid and technophobic can be quite dangerous, even fatal here.
All right, don't want to be a late adopter on this one. Now, you mentioned the hotel economy. Where does China stand in regards to that? Airbnb has tried to make a push into China. China's got its own version to Jia and Shuzhou. What's the outlook for the home sharing or accommodation services industry in China?
So it looks to us like it'll probably make inroads in the up-and-coming vacation locations where we know demand is quite significant and there really isn't an infrastructure. And the truth is, if people discover a desire to go to a new area, it's quite slow and laborious and time-intensive to build up the infrastructure to allow them to rent hotel rooms, but there are share opportunities really quickly. We saw that with the early and rapid penetration of Airbnb into Cuba. I think we're going to see the Chinese allow further work there because they do like the idea of encouraging some tourism to rural areas and helping rural economies to sort of catch up to urban centers. We think that's probably the tip of the spear when it comes to opportunities in mainland China.
All right, very interesting. Thanks as always, Max Wolff, partner at Manhattan Venture Partners.